But the last sentence of the letter is something that no media outlets have picked up on at all and don't wish to discuss or debate. You see, they find it just too awful. Because at the end, what she wrote is there were no white-seeming people manacled on slave ships. You see, in Diane Abbott's world, slavery is just something that white people did to black people, and we are to feel guilty for the rest of time about what happened. Yet the story, I believe, is far more complex, far more complicated, and yet no one ever wants to talk about it. Well, let's talk about it now, tonight on GB News, and I'm joined by author and professor of history at Exeter University, Jeremy Black MBE. Jeremy, thank you very much indeed for joining me tonight on the show. Now, let's try and get some proper facts out there, shall we? Well, wouldn't that make a nice change in this slavery debate? White people, white Europeans, were subject to slavery too. Is that right?
It's absolutely correct, including actually British people. There were Moroccan slave raiders on the coast of Devon, for example, in the 1620s.
Yes, and I also, I mean, these Barbary pirates who took something like
Yes.
1.25 million slaves they took, and yes, they actually landed and raided in Ireland and in Devon and other places like that, and certainly in Italy and countries like that. About 1.25 million white people were taken into slavery. The other thing, Jeremy, that I thought was remarkable, was this book, White Cargo, written a few years ago, explaining that about 300,000 British people in the 17th and 18th century were tricked into going to America and being slaves. Now, if this is true, this would change much of the narrative. What's that story?
Well, people went as indentured labour, and some of them who were convicts, of course, were actually, if you want to use the term, manacled. So the idea which Diane Abbott mentioned, that it was only black people that were manacled, no, that's not true. I think it's fair to say that coercive labour for most people in the world was the norm in the 15th, 16th, 17th century, whether you're a slave, whether you're indentured labour, whether you're convict labour, whether you're a serf. So lots of people of lots of different colours were slaves of some type or other. And you could also argue that into the modern age, people, for example, you could say the entire modern population of North Korea are slaves. There was certainly slavery in the Soviet gulags. There was slavery in the German concentration camps. So the idea that it is only slavery has only been suffered by black people is wrong. And the other point that needs to be faced is all societies, all cultures, all civilizations, all colours are quite capable of inflicting harm on others. The real problem with Diane Abbott's approach is her idea that guilt is hereditary. Now, that's not a principle in British law, and as far as I'm aware, it's not a principle in any other legal code, certainly in any legal code in a democracy. So if you do something and you go to prison, it doesn't mean that your grandson or granddaughter is in some way, a parasite. And I do think, if I was Diane Abbott, I would confront more the problems of the world today. I mean, look, for example, you've already had on your news bulletin the situation in Sudan. But, she's an MP for a London seat. We all know, and the same thing would be true in Exeter, where I live, though on a much smaller scale, within 5 miles of where we live, there are slaves. There will be people that have been sexually trafficked into this country, some of them white, some of them black, for either labour or for sexual purposes. And actually, I would rather Diane Abbott and other MPs were addressing, indeed Theresa May tried to address this in the Modern Slavery Act. And again, the United Nations reckons there's more than 20 million people who are slaves in the world at this moment. Most of them countries like Mauritania, Niger, Sudan again. Possibly Diane Abbott should be devoting her attention to those people rather than sounding off about the 17th and 18th century, about which, alas, she knows very little.
Why do you think it is that in Britain and America in particular, we're being told that somehow we have to atone for what happened centuries ago, and the debate is wholly confined to black people from Africa going over to the Americas? Why are we not allowed, Jeremy, to have this debate that you and I have been having for the last few minutes?
I don't know. I don't know. I think there are a number of people who hate our country. And I think, could I make this clear? This is nothing to do with people of any particular ethnicity. There are white people as well as, you know, who dislike the history of our country. And I'm afraid to say they're just looking for mud to throw. And I don't think it's very attractive. There are problems in Britain. There are things about our history we should be embarrassed about. But that doesn't mean that we have to go around with sackcloth and ashes at the present day. No more than other countries should do for the past, which is well beyond what those of the present day are responsible for. So for all of us, we should feel contrite if we do something wrong ourselves. If my grandfather or great-grandfather did something wrong, that's not, I'm afraid, something that I feel that I have to confess to or feel sick about.
No, quite right. Jeremy Black, thank you very much indeed for joining us on this debate. Of course, if we kept on going down this route, we'd want the Vikings, the countries, Norway, Denmark, they'd have to apologise and send us reparations, as of course would the Italians, and so on and so forth. No, I think on the historical facts, Diane Abbott has proved absolutely conclusively that her history is about as good as her mathematics.